Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. We're very glad that you could join us today for the lawyers in our midst, which I assume is a good chunk of you. Washington State Bar Association CLE credits are available so long as you fill in the survey with both your name and bar number, and we'll get that taken care of for you. Otherwise, welcome to the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. My name is Jeremy Wood. I'm a lawyer in labor and employment practice at Fisher Phillips and a judge pro tem for a number of tribal courts in our area. In another lifetime in the past, I served as chair of the Seattle Human Rights Commission, where I got to do a little more hands-on the sort of work that the Holocaust Center does every day. But I'm here today as a member of the Holocaust Center for Humanities Legal Committee, a group of Seattle area lawyers who organize and promote sessions like today's. So as everyone is logging in, please feel free to take a moment and let us know where you're joining in from. I'm very excited to share the conversation we have today with you all, with two personal heroes of mine, really, who are doing crucial work for human rights victims with a special focus on Ukraine. Last fall, I had the chance to visit that besieged country. Its current challenges, its dark past were difficult to miss. 3 a.m. air raids every night, internal refugees filling the streets, trying to rebuild their lives, and the physical remainder on every building of an aggressive war that has gone on for, I guess, we're past 3 years now. My family had left Ukraine decades before the Holocaust, and any tie we had with the country was strained. But in the warmth of the people, the passion of their strength and commitment to freedom, these have remained enduring sources for me of inspiration. The Holocaust Center is based on a related and similar premise of hope, that we can learn from the darkest points in history to find a brighter future. Why do bad actors do what they do? How can a global community stay silent in the face of atrocity? And what tools are necessary to make a difference? Our two speakers today have been and are instrumental in creating those new tools. Just like the tribunals at Nuremberg revolutionized international law's commitment to holding criminals against humanity accountable, Jamison Firestone and Yuliya Ziskina have crafted new frameworks to respond to the crimes of dictators, oligarchs, and war criminals. Throughout the world, respect for human rights appears on the decline. Increased authoritarianism, aggressive warfare, and atrocity by non-state actors have made it increasingly difficult to hold accountable those who endanger state sovereignty and human dignity. Our panelists are working to change that. Jamison is a member of the New York Bar and a registered foreign lawyer in England. He founded the first independent foreign law firm in Russia and was director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Russia for 6 years. He is a co-founder, along with Sir William Browder, of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, which created the Magnitsky human rights sanctions regimes in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and European Union. He also coordinated the Navalny 35 campaign to sanction corrupt persons and human rights abusers identified by Alexei Navalny. Jamison now works to promote transferring Russia's frozen $300 billion to Ukraine. His practice is focused on compliance, sanctions, and investigations. Yuliya is an attorney specializing in financial enforcement and public international law. She is the principal author of one of the most circulated analyses of transferring Russian state assets to Ukraine, titled Multilateral Asset Transfer, a proposal for ensuring reparations to Ukraine, which has informed the legal basis for legislation in the United States and Canada. Her work has appeared in Lawfare, the European Policy Center, the New Lines Institute, U.S. News, The Hill, and many other publications. Yuliya has testified before Congress on the Repo Act and has been an expert speaker during the World Economic Forum annual meeting, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and in several parliaments. She was previously an ethics prosecutor in New York City and a criminal prosecutor in Seattle. She's originally from Kyiv, where I understand she currently is joining us from today. She also holds a Juris Doctorate from the University of Washington, where we were classmates. Um, Please feel free to enter questions in the chat at any time. We will strive, no promises to answer them as we go along, but there will also be time for your questions at the end. With that, welcome to Jamison and Yuliya. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'd like to start with Jamison, who's been doing this work for several decades now. Jamison, can you tell us about the work uh, you've done and what originally motivated you to get involved?
Sure. So I was a commercial law attorney practicing Russian law, which most of you probably understand by this time is a bit of an oxymoron. But in any case, I was practicing commercial law, and I had a young uh, tax specialist, auditor, and specialist in tax law, Sergey Magnitsky, working for me. And Sergey was really our litigator when it came to tax questions. Yeah, so he was the one who appeared in court for our clients. And at some point, we had a client who was the largest foreign investor in Russia, a man by the name of William Browder, who was running a hedge fund. And it's a crazy story, but the short story is Mr. Browder's companies paid approximately $500 million in tax to the Russian government. And some of his companies were essentially hijacked. Criminals took them over after they had sold everything and paid taxes. These three companies that were hijacked had paid $250 million in tax. And one day we find out not only does my client not own these companies anymore, but they're under criminal control. And what Sergey discovered was that they asked for a refund, a fraudulent refund of $230 million that my client had paid. And this refund was granted in one day. So obviously, everybody was in on it. The tax inspectors were in on it. No, nobody grants a refund for any amount of money in one day, let alone $250 million. So the tax officials were in on it. There were judges in on it, lawyers in on it, and Sergey turned them in, thinking that there was law in Russia. At the time, President Medvedev, he was the lawyer president of Russia. He was saying, we're going to fight legal nihilism. And Sergey took him at his word. So Sergey reported this huge theft from his own government by his own government officials. And he was arrested by the people he testified against, put into prison, tortured for a year, and killed in a Russian jail cell, never having stood trial. As a matter of fact, Sergei has the distinction of being the first posthumous trial to be held in Europe in over 800 years. He was tried after his death. And if you wonder why we don't try people after their deaths, it's because they can't defend themselves. But the Russians weren't very concerned with that. So they found him guilty after his death of essentially committing the crime that he reported. And all of the officials who he had testified against, we started monitoring. I fled Russia. I teamed up with our client, Mr. William Browder, who those were his investment vehicles that were stolen. And we started looking for the looking at the people who Sergei testified against. And they were police officers and judges and tax officers. And we found out that just at the time of the crime, they all started spending huge amounts of money. Or actually, they didn't. Their relatives did. So the police officers who arrested Sergei, one of them, their parents went out and spent $3 million. Another one spent $1.5 million. The tax officers who signed off on these fake refunds got $44 million, and they were buying houses on the Palm Island. And so we tried to get some justice in Russia after his death. We reported all these people. We showed what they were doing. and they were all exonerated. Putin, as a matter of fact, promoted them all and said they were Russia's best investigators, covered it all up. And at that point, when we had pretty much lost hope, uh, Mr. William Browder, my client and partner in this effort, was in the United States talking to U.S. officials. And one U.S. official, Kyle Parker from the Helsinki Committee, said, "Well, why don't we sanction them in the United States? Why don't we ban them from the United States? The president has the power to do this." Um, and so they went ahead and asked they asked Hillary Clinton to do this. It was called the Cardin letter, so to speak. And the president did not act, but the Russians were so terrified of it, and it was front page news, that we realized we really had something here, that corrupt people and human rights abusers in other countries care about protecting the stuff that they have abroad and protecting their travel privileges. And so we realized we had something, and then we went on to lobby for creating a law in Sergei's name called the Magnitsky Act to allow us to prohibit corrupt officials and human rights abusers from coming into the United States, and also from freezing anything they have in the United States. And so in 2012, we successfully got the first Magnitsky Act, which was only operative against Russians and didn't deal with corruption. And then in 2014, we expanded that to a new something called Global Magnitsky, which did the same thing worldwide and included corruption. So what we now have is the Global Magnitsky Act in the United States, and it allows pretty much anybody to go to put forward candidates for sanctioning, or either human rights abusers or corrupt officials or corrupt heads of organizations. And it's now being used all over the world. So NGOs from all over the world are now sending to the US State Department their list of baddies, right? For consideration for sanctioning. So that's how I got into this, quite accidentally, kind of as a least we could do for Sergey. I mean, he paid the ultimate price, and there'll never really be justice for Sergey, but we can have this legacy to him that protects people like him and punishes people like the people who killed him.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, we'll have the chance to talk more about the substance of the Magnitsky Act and the impact it's had. But you mentioned those initial unsuccessful efforts to work with the White House before the statute was passed. Can you speak a little bit about your efforts in Congress to get something on the books? Was there easy buy-in? Were you getting pushback?
So, first of all, the Obama administration was dead set against. If you remember, there's a famous moment when Hillary presented, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton presented her Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, the reset button, with reset spelled improperly in Russian, unfortunately. But they were hell-bent on resetting American-Russian relations, and human rights just kind of gets in the way of these things, right? I mean, everybody's got other priorities like business and money. So we really couldn't get anywhere with with the administration. So we went to Congress, and it was really popular um, on both sides of Congress, but we were still getting held up, and it was actually kind of Israel that saved us here. And I'll tell you how it happened. So if you remember, there was a time when all the Soviet Jews wanted to get out of the Soviet Union for obvious reasons and go to Israel, and the Soviet Union would not allow them to go to Israel. And so what happened was the Jackson-Vanik legislation was put into place, where the Soviets were subjected to unfavorable trading relations if they weren't letting Jewish people leave. And every year they had to certify that the Soviets were behaving and letting people leave in order to get good trading status with the United States. Well, eventually we came to the current situation where everybody who had kind of wanted to leave got out, and Jackson Vanik was just this legacy that had to be approved every year. And when it came time to they need when we got into modern times, Jackson Vanik started to have a kind of bad effect, and the administration wanted to get rid of it, and it wasn't protecting any Jews anymore. So we kind of cut a deal in Congress where we said we're not going to let you get rid of this unless you pass the Magnitsky Act, and so that was the grand bargain that got Magnitsky passed. But the very sad thing was that human rights took a complete backseat, as did
Mm.
the invasion of Crimea. And
Mm.
Yulia will obviously be speaking later about look where that got us, right? Um,
Yeah, yeah, and we can talk about no the unanswered questions that Yulia has been working to answer in this framework. So for a bunch of lawyers in the room, in terms of the process under, I guess now the Global Magnitsky Act, you mentioned NGOs sending in names to the State Department. Is there any specific showing required, or it's just a referral to state and then state makes a decision in a black box?
well, the last part you have correct, black box. But the first part, so the first part is there there are only certain things are sanctionable. Certain acts, certain human rights abuses are uh, serious violations of human rights are sanctionable. Um, Acts of corruption have to be committed by government officials or by heads of organizations. But there's what's really nice, and what's happened is there's an NGO out of Washington D.C. called Human Rights First. And Human Rights First, they run a lot of good programs, but one amazing thing they've done is they've got this Magnitsky Act program. And what the Magnitsky Act program is teaching NGOs all over the world how to use the Magnitsky Act, and so they essentially have templates for a submission to OFAC, and they run seminars on what kinds of human rights violations would get you on there, what kinds of corruption. They provide the templates, and they also partner with lawyers and law firms who are willing to use their expertise to kind of help these NGOs. So Human Rights First will train a lawyer for free or a department of law firm for free how to use the Magnitsky Acts, and then they send NGOs to that law firm who provide pro bono services to clean up their submissions, and then they're submitted. So so you have to be generally it's foreign NGOs that are putting forward uh, the submissions or American NGOs. Uh, and the thing is, they get a lot of them, and they don't act on a lot of them. And that's something else we could come to. The process is not just a black box; it's unfortunately a political process as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously we'll talk about what that political process looks like in our political moment. But we've been talking about a number of frustrations. What about on the flip side? I just wanted to give you the chance to share any notable success stories regarding enforcement of
Well,
the act.
sure. I mean, let me first of all, I mean, just the fact that NGOs all over the world are using this law named after Sergei to go after these people is
Hmm.
amazing. And also, Magnitsky Acts have been enacted in other countries as well. We have one in Canada, we have one in the UK, we have one in the EU, we have and one in Australia, and they're different. For instance, the EU doesn't have corruption as sanctionable. The Canadians have something that's really interesting that nobody else has, which is the ability to actually take the assets and get them to the victims. I don't believe they've actually gone so far as to use the taking part yet, but they have. So in terms of victories, I have a bittersweet victory to share with you, which is um, when Alexei Navalny decided to go back to Russia, um, fully knowing that he would most likely be arrested and perhaps never see the light of day again. About the last thing he did before he got on the airplane was hand us a list of people that he thought the world should sanction.
Mm.
And and we didn't think that the world would do this. Again, political decisions are made, and the higher somebody is, or the richer somebody is, the less likely they're to get sanctioned usually. But so we were putting in all these submissions. I was putting in submissions. The Anti-Corruption Foundation, Navalny's organization, was putting them in. And for the most part, they weren't being acted on. But when the war broke out, all of a sudden, these people get sanctioned left and right. And when you're reading the press releases from OFAC, they're word for word in parts from my sanction submissions or things that the Navalny's anti-corruption foundation had been saying. So our stuff was being read, and it was just a matter of they had decided not to act, but when they needed to act, it didn't take them long because it was all there, so to speak. But a great victory, which I should mention, is that when we have gotten the Magnitsky Acts enacted in almost every country where we've had them enacted, the first names that have gone on the list are all the people who had Sergei falsely arrested, the people who committed the crime that he discovered, and the people who ultimately led to his death. So that's good that those people, as one of my friends who for many years she ran a travel agency an over-the-top travel agency in Russia for oligarchs, and she said, Jamison, you and Bill have created a completely new field for me, and it's exclusive travel for the jurisdictionally challenged. Right.
Speaking of uh, disappointments in the lives of oligarchs, you mentioned that Canada's Magnitsky Act equivalent has a mechanism to pay seized assets, to redirect seized assets towards the victims of these crimes. What happens under the current framework in the United States to those assets?
They're simply frozen. They're never taken. They're never used. So
Right. So what?
unfortunately,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's so they're frozen, and that's it. Um, I mean, one thing about when you freeze an asset is that at least if it's sitting there and you can prove corruption or something, in theory, the Justice Department could go after it, but they tend not to. I mean, they've done that in a few cases for oligarch assets when sanctions were broken, but not on human rights grounds. But in any case, the asset is frozen. One of the things about Magnitsky sanctions, even though there is an off ramp in the Magnitsky sanctions, that there are two off ramps. One is if the behavior has substantially changed and the government wants to give you an off ramp, they could, although that's unlikely to be used for massive human rights abuses, but it might be used for sanction corrupt people who are useful to us. But in general, Magnitsky sanctions differ from other sanctions in that they're almost a one-way street. I mean, we're sanctioning people who have broken the civilized laws that we all live by. And so it's very unlikely that if you're sanctioned under Magnitsky, that you're going to get off. So your stuff is probably gone, frozen forever, as opposed to the sanctions that have come in for the war, where many people have been sanctioned because their businesses are helpful to the Russian regime. But should the war end, they'll just be unsanctioned.
So yeah, so speaking of the war, so 3 years and 3 months ago, Russia invades
Yes.
Ukraine. How has the war shaped or shifted the work you're doing, Jameson?
So, right. So we were going after um, freezing bad guys' stuff and keeping them out of our countries. I mean, essentially, our argument when we would pass Magnitsky Acts are, all right, who's opposed to the idea of keeping bad guys out of our country, right? And it's hard to argue with. But when the Ukrainian invasion happened, immediately you start to think about two things. You start to think about getting Ukraine money to defend itself, and you saw those images from Bucha. How do you get money to to the survivors for reparations? And we started thinking like, well, where's the money? And it turned out that the money wasn't all this oligarch stuff. Because the oligarch stuff, I mean, if you think about it, right, you get some oligarch has a plaything, a yacht that costs $500 million, right? It's 500 million and they freeze it. But that yacht is owned by some offshore company, owned by an offshore trust, owned by this, owned by that. And he's got more money to spend than the Justice Department is willing
Mm.
to do. And more than that, so you spend years trying to go after an oligarch asset, and you may or may not get it. And and what was what turned out to be the pot of money was that surprisingly, when the invasion happened, everybody was going, oh, maybe we'll throw the Russians out of the SWIFT system. But something totally unexpected happened, which was that the G7 acting in coordination froze the Russian central bank reserves. Half of Russia's central bank reserves was in China and gold in Russia, and the other half was in the G7. And this huge pot of money was frozen. And then the question became, well, can we give it to Ukraine and the victims? And that's where I met Yulia.
Oh, that's a great segue. Yulia, you've been doing a lot of work on what to do with these pots of money and these yachts sitting in the water. But before we turn to that, obviously you're sitting in Kyiv right now. What has this war meant for you? How did you find your way to this work?
Well, I can't say that my story is as dramatic as Jamison's, but it is still quite personal. I'm Ukrainian myself. I was born in Kiev. My parents and I were Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union, and we relocated to the United States. I grew up with still personal close ties to Ukraine. I have some family members who were still here, but unfortunately were killed under occupation not too long ago. When the full-scale invasion broke out, my first thought was, how do I help? It's my responsibility. What do I do? Um, I had a brief thought of serving in the army, but then I realized that nobody wants me on the front lines, and that's not a great idea for someone like me. But I decided to use my background and my skills in a particular way to help as much as I could. So my background is in financial enforcement, in economic crimes, and human rights. So I kind of found my way into this sort of also accidentally. I read an op-ed in the Washington Post by someone named Philip Zelikow, arguing about using Russia's own money to rebuild and protect Ukraine. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. It's poetic justice. It's simple. What could possibly, how could anybody object to this? And so I set about writing a legal memo about the legal basis on which to do this, on the nuts and bolts, and how to actually bring this into reality. Um, my very naive first thought was, well, this will probably only take a couple of months once people read this and realize, yeah, we can do it. It'll happen quite fast. But unfortunately, we're still here 3 years later. This is how I met Jamison, who was also working on this, and we joined forces and have been writing papers, advocating to governments, busting misconceptions, writing more articles, and writing to decision makers, meeting with decision makers, and advocating this for the past 3 years.
So for the legal nerds amongst us here, can you talk a little bit about those nuts and bolts and what you put forward in that memo?
Absolutely. So first, I want to highlight what Jameson said earlier, and I want to draw a distinction between Jameson's work on Magnitsky sanctions and my work and our work together on the state assets, which is sovereign money rather than private assets. So by sovereign funds, we mean the assets of the Russian central bank mostly. This is important to draw this distinction because there are different legal frameworks and different legal mechanisms that apply to private property versus state property. And this has actually been the source of a lot of misunderstanding and obstacles towards actually seizing this money. So that's why I bring it up now. So the legal basis for seizing, or I guess more accurately, you could say transferring frozen Russian state assets for Ukraine's benefit is the doctrine of state countermeasures. The basic idea of countermeasures is that they are a decentralized self-help tool to enforce international obligations. So when a state's misconduct is so egregious that it violates the very core norms of international law, that violates the UN Charter, it's considered to affect the entire global community, erga omnes, for, again, law nerds, and a third-party state can take countermeasures against it. So the countermeasures are intended to stop the wrongful conduct and to also compel the payment of compensation, which under international law, victims are entitled to. So in this case, by transferring those assets to an international compensation mechanism, third-party states would cause Russia to comply with its existing obligation to make reparations. So this transfer would be credited as a offset, or I guess you could call it a down payment, against the debt that Russia already owes, which is already more than the sum of its frozen reserves. So, and I get an important note to bring up here, I think also, is that this is not seizure or confiscation per se, although we use those words interchangeably, because the US and Europe and other countries would not be using these funds for themselves. Instead, what we're really talking about is a transfer on behalf of war victims and the victim state, which are legal beneficiaries of an existing debt. Except it's a debt that currently can't be enforced because Russia is never going to voluntarily pay reparations, which it has never done throughout its entire imperialist history. So the question becomes, how do we do that? Yeah, that's the brief overview.
Oh, thank you for that. So this might be a premature question, but I guess in your hope, what would distribution of these funds look like? Are we thinking of some sort of claims conference distributing to affected individuals, to the Ukrainian government, NGOs? How are you imagining that part of this playing out?
Well, Ukraine's needs are many. Right now, obviously a huge need is defense, and we can talk about the legal
Mhm.
basis of using these funds for defense and what that could possibly look like legally. Another is, of course, compensating the victims of Russia's aggression. And there is a mechanism that's envisioned and currently being set up for this. So the Register of Damage is already established under the Council of Europe. The register is designed to be a record of all the eligible claims for compensation, for damage, loss, and an injury that's been inflicted in and against Ukraine. It's already received tens of thousands of claims from individuals, businesses, NGOs, and the Ukrainian state itself can also be a claimant. So the claimants are actually quite broad. The next step, once this record is set up, will be for a claims commission to evaluate the claim, and then for a compensation fund, in principle, which would be holding the Russian state assets, to pay out those claims. This is what's envisioned, but what I believe this is lacking is it doesn't address the immediate critical needs. So what I've described is a very reactive process, and obviously adjudication like this was going to take some time. But what Ukraine needs now is proactive support. And reconstruction and reparations, when we talk about this isn't just something that happens, quote unquote, after the war is over. It's needed immediately to save lives, to rebuild critical infrastructure, hospitals, railways, economic support for the country, and so much more. And that's why Jamison and I are advocating that this money must actually be used now to help Ukraine actually sustain itself during the war. And this is also why using the funds to support defense efforts is important as well, especially as US support becomes more uncertain.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack. What sort of traction are you seeing on efforts to get this money over where it's needed now rather than when the war is concluded and when the claims are adjudicated?
I think it's still a matter of continuing to educate and to advocate, but
Mhm.
gradually we are seeing progress being made. For example, as you mentioned previously at the beginning of the program, the US passed a law called the Repo Act, which specifically authorizes the US president to seize and transfer frozen Russian state assets in the US into a Ukraine support fund, and then to later transfer them into an international mechanism. This passed with a bipartisan majority. Very, very few Congress people objected to this, but it has yet to be implemented. Um, across the pond, as a result of a lot of advocacy that we and our German colleagues have done over the past year, the new German coalition agreement contains a statement that the new German government will look for ways to use Russian assets for Ukraine's reconstruction and defense. This is quite big and quite important actually, because from the beginning, Germany is and was one of the most resistant countries to this idea. And a year ago, it would have been unthinkable for its government to even mention the frozen assets. And as a result of advocacy and initiatives in other countries, in Canada, just last month, ahead of the election, the Conservative Party pledged to seize the assets, which was the first time that a political party has made such a commitment. And as Jamison mentioned, Canada already has a law that it can use to seize and transfer these assets. And we've actually written an amendment to it that could operationalize it and strengthen that legal basis even more. Canada just needs to use it.
Yeah.
The UK Parliament in January unanimously passed a motion calling on its government to use the frozen funds. Just last month, the French Parliament did too. The Swiss Parliament passed a very similar motion about a year ago. And so what this shows is that this is really a ground up effort where the push tends to originate in parliaments. And this was also the same for the US because the Repo Act originated in Congress.
Yeah, no, I mean, if Switzerland's willing to start seizing bad money inside its borders, that's a shift. Um, I do want to talk about the climate here that you referenced. Here, being the United States, obviously you're not with us now. But before I do that, you mentioned some of the nuance around the use of these funds for Ukraine's armed defense. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, typically the question is, can these funds be used for military operations?
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, I'm going to give you a very true lawyerly answer in that yes and no, and it depends. So as I mentioned previously, under countermeasures, Russia owes this compensation debt to Ukraine, and this can be quantified. It's already been quantified by the World Bank. And the principal of the funds can be used as sort of a down payment for this purpose and to offset against that debt. Under countermeasures, to use that money for military operations is a bit more of a less straightforward argument. However, I think there are ways to strengthen that legal basis. So first, it could be potentially justified under a different doctrine, such as collective self-defense. There's political reasons why countries don't want to do that. Second, I think this is probably the better way, is to use the proceeds generated on the frozen assets for military defense purposes, which is already happening, but it could be done better. The EU has decided that the proceeds that are generated on the frozen reserves don't legally belong to Russia. So there's fewer restrictions on what can be done with them. Currently, the frozen reserves are passively managed through overnight funds, which yield a very low profit. And these profits are used for Ukraine's defense. The latest distribution was about €1 billion just last week, and it's about 3 billion yearly. It's better than nothing, not a lot of money. But if the frozen assets are transferred into a fund, an investment fund or a compensation fund, like we talked about earlier, with a established professional investment management
Hmm.
structure, active portfolio management with perhaps higher risk but higher reward, it's possible to generate more profits that can be used for military defense while keeping the principle of the funds for compensation and reconstruction and using that towards victims. So there are ways to do this. It just simply requires political will.
Yeah, so speaking of that, Jameson mentioned the Obama and Clinton administrations earlier. We've seemed to have an administration that's more interested in President Zelensky's outfits than in Ukraine's security. So my question to both of you, are there doors open to this work within the United States government at this moment? What does your work look like in the US right now?
Well, to be quite honest, we simply don't know what the current US administration's posture is towards these assets. So that's both a liability and an opportunity in some ways. So there's no set plan yet. But given a lot of the rhetoric that we've seen from Trump and the administration since January, like you pointed out, I think it would be wise to prepare for the worst. That's simply the world that we live in currently. In other words, if the sanctions are lifted and the US also potentially starts pressuring and emboldening Hungary, Slovakia, and others in the EU to lift sanctions, we could be in a world of trouble. Um, so the worst case scenario is that the US lifts sanctions, this money goes back to Russia, and it also pushes Hungary and Slovakia to do the same. And why do I bring that up and why is that important? Well, besides the obvious, every 6 months, the EU must unanimously vote to renew sanctions. If even one EU member state votes against the asset freeze, which is coming up at the end of July, the freeze would then lapse. The Central Bank of Russia would withdraw its deposit from Euroclear, which is a Belgium-based securities depository where these funds are mostly held. And Euroclear would then have to comply. There would be nothing stopping Euroclear from giving the funds back. So that money would be returned. Once the assets go back to Russia, this can't be reversed, and we have 200 billion or more euro just gone. So in terms of the US, ironically, we've been saying for a long time that Europe and the UK should follow the example of the US. Look, we've passed repo, we've passed a law. Now it's time for you to do the same. It was also the US that led on the initial asset freeze. It was also the US that led on the $50 billion loan from the proceeds on the frozen assets. But now, ironically, that argument is now flipped. And now the argument is Europe, UK, don't follow the example of the US potentially. And it's now up to you to hold the line and to lead. So the coalition of the willing in Europe shouldn't just be about military support to Ukraine. It also needs to be a coalition of willing nations to transfer the Russian state assets, where they should be kept outside of Hungary's veto, whether or not the US joins that effort.
Yeah, so given um, that at best uncertainty from the US, uncertainty in inaction, and at worse. Um, we've got a bunch of lawyers on here. We have our local and state governments and that in other areas of policy are trying to hold lines against the administration. Is there a place for local governments, for private lawyers to assist in this work?
Yes, absolutely. Jameson and I are largely, this is a personal effort. No one's telling us how to do things or what to do. So to the lawyers on this call, and I'm sure Jameson can fill in, I would say donate your expertise, donate your credibility. As attorneys, our voices carry a lot of weight. So it's important to speak up, to shape the narrative, to write articles, talk to decision makers, and educate those around you. Um, don't wait for somebody to tell you what to do and just do it and use your legal education to just do the right thing. Because as we've seen from the US administration, from European decision makers, if we don't do it, those in power aren't going to do it without that pressure and without that push. So it's really up to us from the ground level as leaders in this community um, to do that. And if anybody is interested who's watching this, please reach out. We'd be happy to have you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's also specialist expertise. We're always looking for people who have certainly people who are banking specialists and banking law, very helpful. Just because, as Yulia pointed out, uh, the vast majority of this money is controlled out of Belgium, but that doesn't actually mean it's in Belgium. So there's 15. Just as an example, the Euroclear in Belgium holds 15 billion US dollars, and the way the international banking system works is that when you hold US dollars, you have to hold them in a US bank, basically. So if I'm sitting in the United Kingdom right now, if there are two banks across the street from each other here, and I want to send $100 from one bank to the other, it's really moving $100 between two U.S. banks, two correspondent banks that each have a relationship with the British banks. But that means that this 15 billion that's being managed by Euroclear in Belgium is actually sitting in the United States. And the United States has, if it wished to execute, if it wished to use jurisdiction to exercise its jurisdiction over that 15 billion under the Repo Act, it could. Um, so we're always looking for people who have in-depth knowledge of banking because we have to explain this to officials. Officials often say, well, that money's in Belgium. And we're like, actually, that money is not in Belgium. It's being managed from Belgium right here in the United States, or right there in Canada, or right there in the United Kingdom. So lots of room for people with expertise. Lots of if you're an expert and a recognized expert in a field, it helps if your name's on a paper when we submit it, if there's recognition there, and it certainly helps talking to the politicians if you have the ability to do it, because as Yulia said, it's the parliaments that generally get this done. I mean, it's Congress that got the Magnitsky Act done for us, and it's almost been parliaments in every country we went to. Governments resisted passing the legislation and using the legislation, and it was essentially put over their heads by their legislatures because it's generally doing the right thing is popular. I guess when you're sitting in the president's chair, you can think of lots of reasons, why not to sanction some human rights violator when the United States needs some cooperation in that country, or why not to sanction the corrupt oligarch when he's the prime minister of a country that you need some help from. But all of that actually can be overcome by just the weight of popular opinion.
I think that's a great note to segue to questions from our audience. I don't see questions in the chat on my end, but I would ask Richard if he's received any on his. And otherwise, folks are free at this time to type in any questions they might have.
Yeah, Jeremy, there is one question in the Q&A from Jillian asking if there's any evidence that the Magnitsky Act is having any effect on wrongdoers.
Aha. Well, I can tell you yes and no. So I can. What's interesting is people. So people don't tend to fear it until the eye turns towards them, so to speak. So you got a lot of corrupt people, or human rights abusers who are kind of just going about the nasty business of theirs. But as soon as people actually talk about sanctioning them, as soon as as soon as NGOs put it forward, they all get real nervous and start talking about, what they need to do not to be sanctioned. So I can't tell you that it's been super effective yet. And part of that reason it hasn't been super effective yet is what I mentioned before, the political nature of the of sanctioning people. If you really wanted to make Magnitsky sanctions effective as a deterrent, you would sanction, 500 people every quarter. You would just have people send in their names. You'd have OFAC go through it and get your list of baddies. And they're not that hard to find because there's lots of terrible stuff going out there. We're committed by people who are, for all practical purposes, immune from prosecution in the places that they come from. A- And if you started en masse doing this, then yes, people would go, hold on a minute. So Mr. Putin wants me to put Mr. Navalny in jail. I've already had 35 years of corrupt practice and have my apartment and my car, and I don't feel like actually being banned from every country in the world. So this is a great time to resign as a judge and just not do this, right? And that would start to happen, and also people would start to think about what they're willing to do. But we're just not there yet because it's such a political process. The United States tends to think, okay, which countries are we kind of annoyed at right now? And let's pick some people in those jurisdictions. And every once in a while, you have an exception, like the Saudis cutting up the journalist Khashoggi in the Turkish embassy, where it's so egregious that it doesn't really matter. If the government wants to make nice with Saudi, you just have to do something. But most cases aren't like that. So they do work when the eye turns in the direction of a group of people or in organizations or a country. But again, we're not really using them enough to make the difference.
Absolutely. So Lisa asks, and I think, Jameson, you've spoken to this, but what non-lawyer citizens can do to help. You mentioned other areas of expertise that are helpful to you around the banking system and generally the importance of public pressure. But I wanted to put that question to you if you have any further response.
Sure. I mean, look, we have, I mean, Yulia and I know people in other countries where we don't have the experience, we don't have the contacts. And so many people have helped us by saying, I can get you in front of this person. I can get an op-ed published in this paper on this matter. It's all about getting the word out to the public and to officials, and everybody can help in that.
So
I can add on to that a little bit. I love that question because I think so often this topic is portrayed as this complicated, experts only topic that only lawyers or economists can talk about. And we tend to fall into that trap a little bit too. But at its core, I think it's really not. It's a political issue, just like any political issue is. If there's political will to do it, then it will be done, and there will be experts who will figure out how to do it. So no, regular non-lawyers, citizens can still advocate for it, but being informed about some of these main, I guess, foundational elements of it is still key. So it's great that you're listening to this call. There's plenty of resources out there, and also happy to answer any questions anytime.
Yeah, I should add to that, like a great example is that Yulia was really kind of in on the ground floor here in coming up with the legal proofs that international law would allow the transfer of the Russian central bank assets. Because everybody's going, oh, sovereign immunity, you can't touch it, you can't touch it. And Yulia was like, well, actually, you're wrong. There's this exception in international law. It took us over a year to really get those arguments out there to the point where we're confident there is no legal argument anymore. There's no good legal argument not to take this money and give it to Ukraine as a partial payment of the reparations that Russia already owes. But why it isn't happening is because really what's happening is an economic argument where governments are going, okay, if the United States takes this money, then they're going to be like the Saudis and all these other human rights abusing regimes won't keep their money in the US. And the Europeans are doing the same thing. They're like, what if the Qataris pull their money? What if the UAE pulls their money? They're actually sending delegations around to countries like the French saying, um, if you vote in favor of taking this money, we'll start dumping your bonds. Um, Economic blackmail. And so what's important is for once the legal issue is solved, is for people to make a choice that we don't think we've already frozen this money for 3 years. If we've frozen it for 3 years and the world hasn't ended, Russia's never getting it back. I mean, everybody's announced already that we don't intend to give it back until the Russians pay. I mean, it could get back accidentally, like Yuliya said, because Hungary doesn't agree to extend the sanctions, and the European sanctions have a massive fail. But my point is that the the economic foundation of the world has not collapsed after the G7 sees this 300 billion, nor will it collapse should we give it to Ukraine. But governments are cowardly, and nobody wants to take the risk, so to speak. And so it helps when people step up and say, no, this is the right thing to do. There's no legal barrier here. This is a political thing, and the will of the people is X.
Thank you, Jameson. We have a few more questions. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for them. I'll just say that John has asked if contact information can be shared, and we can make sure that that happens. In the meantime, I just want to sincerely thank Jameson and Yuliya. I'm reading a book right now called East West Street about two lawyers from Lviv who created our modern definition of genocide some 70, 80 years ago. And I think of the resistance when folks first tried to prosecute aggressive war following the Second World War, and the resistance at every stage of these new frameworks to protect victims of human rights abuses. Whether, Jameson, it's you realizing that you might not be able to go after these folks in Russia, but you could go after them in the U.S. And Yuliya, you speaking to the poetic justice of the work that you're doing. So thank you for speaking with us, but thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for the work that you both do every day. For everyone else, our next Lunch and Learn program is Tuesday, June 10th. Nazism today obviously is seen as a symbol of tyranny, racism, genocide. But we'll look at what it meant to those who espoused it, who saw themselves as heroic patriots defending Germany from perceived threats like, quote, Judeo-Bolshevism, liberalism, democracy. We'll hear how that self-image helped legitimize their rise to power and the creation of a totalitarian racialist state through the 1930s. If you find our programming interesting and meaningful, please consider making a donation. Your donations make this programming and education feasible to share. There's a link in the chat, or you can find a link on our website, of course. And thank you to my colleagues on the Holocaust Center for Humanities Legal Committee, Stephen Begelmacher, Mark Bowman, Sonia Carlson, Kathy Feldman, Ron Friedman, Maria Hodgins, Lucas Michaels, Jay Rifkin, Sabrina Shapiro, and Rob Spitzer. If you're a lawyer and you're interested in joining us, please contact Jessica Michaels at the Holocaust Center. Her email address is also available online. Thank you to Jessica, Richard, and all of our staff at the Holocaust Center. A special thanks to Richard, who ran us through the tech on this and made sure that things went according to plan. Lastly, we are grateful to the German Claims Conference, the Conference on Material Claims Against Germany, for their support of this program. Thank you all once more, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.